My name is Catherine Daniels. I'm 37 years old, and until last year, I believed that kindness could change people. That if you were patient enough, forgiving enough, you could soften even the hardest hearts. It took losing everything and everyone I thought I could trust to finally learn that kindness without boundaries isn't compassion, it's self-destruction. The story began with a cabin. Not just any cabin, but the one my late father built with his own hands when I was a child. It stood high in the Colorado mountains, surrounded by pine trees so tall they seemed to touch the sky. I could still remember the smell of cedar when I walked through the front door, the way the floor creaked beneath my bare feet, and the old rocking chair on the porch where he used to read stories to me on summer nights. After he passed away when I was 17, the cabin became more than a place. It became a promise. A piece of him I could hold on to when the world felt too cruel. My mother remarried 2 years later to a man named Richard. I tried to be open-minded, but from the beginning, something about him never felt right. His smile was too practiced, his compliments too shallow, his eyes always searching for something to own. He worked as a car dealer, charming, persuasive, always chasing the next big deal. My mother fell for his confidence, his expensive suits, the way he made her laugh. But beneath the surface, he was reckless. He gambled, he drank, and he treated money like it was a game that only existed to be won or lost. When my mother passed away 5 years ago, Richard became even worse. Without her to keep him grounded, he spiraled into a mess of debt and desperation. I stayed polite, distant, but polite because no matter how much I disliked him, he was still the man my mother once loved. I had no idea how far his greed would reach. One rainy afternoon, while I was at work managing a small architecture firm, my phone buzzed. It was Richard. I almost ignored it, but something, maybe guilt, maybe habit, made me pick up. "Catherine," he said, his tone too casual, too light. "You might want to sit down for this." "What is it, Richard?" "I sold your mountain cabin." The words didn't register at first. I laughed, thinking it was one of his cruel jokes. "You what?" "Had to settle some debts. The cabin fetched a good price. You should be proud your dad built a solid one." He chuckled as if he'd just told me a funny story. For a moment I couldn't speak. The air felt heavy, thick. My hand shook as I gripped the phone. "That cabin wasn't yours to sell." "Well," he said, his voice hardening, "technically it was. Your mother added my name to the deed years ago. Joint ownership, sweetheart. I had every legal right. Then he laughed again. A slow, satisfied, cruel laugh that made my stomach turn. "You'll get over it. It's just wood and nails." I hung up before I said something I'd regret. That night, I drove up to the cabin in the pouring rain, hoping it wasn't true. But when I arrived, a for sale sign stood crooked in the mud. The porch was empty. The rocking chair was gone. I broke down right there in the driveway, rain mixing with tears until I couldn't tell which was which. I wanted to scream, to destroy something, to make the universe take back what it had allowed him to do. But grief doesn't roar, it chokes. It sits quietly inside you until you can't breathe. I spent the next week in a haze. My lawyer confirmed what Richard said: my mother had added him to the deed years ago when she was ill, wanting to make things easier. He'd sold it to settle his gambling debts, and there was nothing I could do. Or at least that's what everyone said. But deep down, something inside me refused to accept that this was the end. I couldn't get his laugh out of my head. The sound of his smug victory replayed over and over like a curse. So I decided to do something I'd never done before. I decided to fight back, not through anger, but through patience. Richard loved to brag. He couldn't help himself. So I started watching, listening, waiting. I found out he'd sold the cabin to a private buyer, but when I dug deeper, I discovered that buyer didn't exist. It was a shell company, one Richard had created himself. He hadn't sold the cabin to anyone. He was hiding it using fake transactions to make it seem legitimate while he worked on flipping the property for 3 times its worth. And the more I uncovered, the angrier I became. He'd taken the last piece of my father's legacy, not because he needed to survive, but because he wanted to profit from it. I hired a private investigator. What he found made my blood run cold. Richard had used my mother's old medical accounts, her insurance policies, even her social security number in shady financial paperwork. He'd been laundering money under her name for years. He didn't just betray me, he betrayed her. The rage I felt wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady like a heartbeat. I realized then that revenge didn't need to be dramatic. It just needed to be precise. I began documenting everything, every fraudulent signature, every fake invoice, every shady transfer, and I waited for the right moment. When it came, it was almost poetic. Richard invited me to dinner at a restaurant downtown. I think he wanted to gloat to rub salt in the wound. He wore one of his usual smug smiles, ordering expensive wine he probably couldn't afford. "I hear you're still upset about the cabin," he said between bites. "You really need to let that go, Catherine. Your father's been gone for years. Move on." I smiled. "You're right, I should let it go." He grinned, pleased with himself. "That's my girl." I leaned forward slightly. "You know I've been looking into that sale. The company you sold it to, Silver Ridge Holdings, wasn't it?" He froze. I continued, my tone calm. "Funny thing, Richard, that company doesn't exist. Not really. But the account it's tied to? That's interesting. It's in your name, but it's also connected to two offshore accounts. Accounts that are under investigation for money laundering." He dropped his fork. "What are you talking about?" I smiled, the same polite, empty smile he'd always given me. "I'm talking about justice, the kind that doesn't laugh." His face drained of color. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I said softly. "Because the IRS doesn't think so, and neither does the FBI." He stood abruptly, knocking his chair over. "You wouldn't?" "I already did." The look on his face shocked disbelief, then panic was the most satisfying thing I'd ever seen. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I just stood, gathered my purse, and said, "You shouldn't have sold the cabin, Richard. It was never yours to sell." I walked out, leaving him there, red-faced, sputtering, his empire of lies beginning to crumble. 2 weeks later, he was arrested. Fraud, tax evasion, identity theft. The cabin became evidence in the investigation, and after months of hearings and court filings, it was officially restored under my name. But by the time it came back to me, it no longer felt like home. It was just an empty shell of what it used to be. Still, I decided to go there one last time, not to mourn, but to reclaim something far more important than property. When I returned to the mountain cabin after it was legally mine again, the drive felt longer than I remembered. Every mile of winding road seemed to peel away another layer of the person I used to be. The naive woman who still believed family could be fixed if you just loved them hard enough. By the time I reached the cabin, I wasn't Catherine the daughter anymore. I was Catherine the survivor. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it that last rainy night. The same creaking porch, the same sagging roofline, the same faint smell of cedar and ghosts. But it was quiet now, painfully quiet. No birdsong, no laughter. Just the sound of wind pressing against the trees like a memory trying to get in. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The light from the window cut through layers of dust, revealing furniture shrouded in old sheets. My father's workbench still stood in the corner, his tools lined up like soldiers waiting for orders that would never come. I brushed my hand over the surface dust splinters, the faintest trace of him still lingering in the grain of the wood. It hit me so hard that I had to sit down. For years I'd imagined this place as a sanctuary, but standing there, I realized it was also a witness. It had seen my father's love, my mother's fragility, and Richard's corruption. And now it was watching me to see what kind of woman I'd become after all that loss. I lit a small fire in the stone fireplace. The crackle filled the silence, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. But peace is deceptive, it's never still for long. Because when I looked around the cabin, I saw what Richard had really taken from me. It wasn't just money or wood or stone. He'd stolen the last sacred place where I felt safe. And even though justice had already been served, part of me wanted him to feel what I had felt. The humiliation, the betrayal, the shame, the hollow ache of losing everything that mattered. But revenge, I learned, doesn't always come with a plan. Sometimes it arrives disguised as opportunity. While clearing out some old boxes in the cabin, I found a folder of documents that belonged to my father. Deeds, letters, photos, old business receipts. Tucked between them was a faded envelope labeled "Property Adjoining Lot Pending Transfer." I unfolded it carefully. Inside were plans for an adjoining acre of land that Richard had never known about. It had never been transferred to him because my father hadn't finalized the paperwork. It was still under my father's estate, which meant now it belonged to me. I smiled for the first time in weeks. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who stole my cabin never even realized there was more to take. A few months later, I decided to rebuild not the cabin, but its legacy. On that hidden acre, I began construction on a small retreat center, a quiet place where women could come to recover from loss, betrayal, and grief. I called it the Lantern Ridge because light I'd learned matters most when everything else has gone dark. As construction went on, I'd drive up every weekend sometimes, staying overnight to oversee progress. The crew was small but loyal, and one of them, a middle-aged man named Tom, quickly became my friend. He'd worked on mountain properties his whole life, and he respected the story of the place. You know, he said one evening as we packed up, a place like this carries energy. You're giving it a new purpose. That matters. I nodded. Maybe it's time it stops holding ghosts. He smiled. Maybe it's time you stop holding them too. His words lingered long after he left. By the time the Lantern Ridge opened, the seasons had changed. The first snow fell soft and slow across the roofs like forgiveness. The place wasn't grand, just 4 wooden cabins and a main lodge with wide windows overlooking the valley. But it was peaceful, pure, honest. Everything Richard's greed could never touch. I started welcoming small groups of women survivors of divorce, betrayal, financial ruin. They'd sit by the fire in the evenings, share stories of heartbreak and hope. And every time one of them said, "I thought I'd never recover," I'd smile and tell them, "You already are." I never told them about Richard. They didn't need to know the details. But they could feel the truth in my voice, the kind of empathy that only comes from surviving the same fire. One night, as the guests slept and the snow fell thick outside, I received a letter. It was from Richard's lawyer. "Dear Ms. Daniels, we're writing to inform you that Mr. Richard Calloway has filed an appeal against the charges of fraud. He maintains that the property transfer and financial actions were done with your mother's consent and that you have falsely accused him. The hearing is scheduled for next month." My stomach turned. I read it twice, 3 times. I knew what this was. A desperate man's last attempt to rewrite the truth. I didn't panic this time. I didn't cry. I just folded the letter neatly and placed it beside the fire. The next day I drove down to Denver to meet my lawyer, and together we prepared the final evidence documents, recordings, bank statements, and one piece of information Richard never expected me to have: his recorded call with the fake property agent he used to sell the cabin. I'd had the investigator record everything before his arrest. That one conversation alone was enough to destroy his defense completely. But I didn't want to destroy him anymore. I wanted him to see what he'd destroyed in himself. The dignity, the decency, the last fragments of his soul. The day of the hearing, I wore a simple black coat. No makeup, no jewelry, just calm. When Richard entered the courtroom, he looked like a ghost of his former self, thinner, older, his swagger gone. Our eyes met only once. For the first time, I didn't see the man who stole my life. I saw a broken gambler who had finally run out of cards. The judge reviewed the evidence in silence. When my turn came to speak, I stood up slowly, every heartbeat steady. "Your Honor," I said, "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for closure. This man took something sacred from me, not money, but trust. I'm not asking the court to punish him. I'm asking for acknowledgement that what he did was wrong." For the first time, Richard didn't interrupt. He didn't roll his eyes, he just lowered his head. When the judge delivered the verdict, full conviction, no appeal granted, I felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction. Just quiet, like the kind of silence that follows a storm after the final crack of thunder. After court, as I stepped outside into the cold, Richard called out softly, "Catherine." I turned. He looked at me, his face pale, his voice trembling. "I never meant to hurt you. I just didn't know how to stop losing." I stared at him for the long time before answering. "You didn't lose because of me, Richard. You lost because you thought love was something you could win." Then I walked away and didn't look back. That night, as I drove up to the cabin, the road seemed shorter. The mountain felt gentler. For the first time, it felt like my father's spirit was there, not haunting but guiding. The lantern ridge lights glowed through the snow, a soft amber warmth against the dark. I finally realized some stories don't end with revenge. They end with peace, the kind you build for yourself, even when others tried to take it from you. It took months after the trial for my life to finally slow down, to let the noise of justice fade into something quieter. I thought that winning the case would feel like a victory, but instead it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. The cabin, the court, the papers, all of it was finished. But healing was something else entirely. I spent most days at the Lantern Ridge, watching it come alive in ways I never imagined. Each week, new guests arrived carrying their own versions of grief. A woman who'd lost her marriage after 20 years. A young widow who still wore her husband's ring. A mother who hadn't spoken to her daughter in a decade. They came with broken voices, and they left with lighter eyes. Somehow that made the mountains feel sacred again. Every morning, I'd make coffee and sit by the porch as the fog rolled through the trees. That silence, that sacred stillness, had become my new kind of wealth. No more debt, no more lies, no more family ghosts whispering in my ear. And yet some mornings I'd still think about Richard. Not out of longing, not out of forgiveness, but curiosity. Where does someone like him go when everything he's built has collapsed? Does he wake up, regretting what he did, or does he still believe he was the victim of bad luck? Sometimes I'd wonder if he remembered my mother, if he ever felt the sting of betraying the one person who believed in him. But I didn't dwell on it. I couldn't. There's a difference between remembering the past and living inside it. Then one afternoon I received an unexpected call. It was from a state rehabilitation counselor asking if I would consider speaking at a halfway home for white-collar offenders, a short talk about rebuilding life after ruin. Apparently, one of the counselors had visited the Lantern Ridge and thought my story could help inspire others. At first, I wanted to say no. The last thing I wanted was to stand in front of men who reminded me of Richard. But that night, as I walked along the ridge beneath a quiet sky, I remembered something my father once told me. You don't bury pain by ignoring it, Catherine. You bury it by planting something stronger in its place. So I agreed. 2 weeks later, I drove to Denver to the rehabilitation center. It was a modest facility, sterile walls, pale lighting, the faint scent of coffee and detergent. The audience was small, mostly men in their 50s and 60s wearing gray uniforms and weary expressions. As I spoke about rebuilding, about loss, about finding peace through purpose, rather than revenge, I felt something shift. The words didn't come from rehearsed lines, they came from scars. Afterward, as the audience began to file out, one of the counselors approached me. "Someone asked to speak to you privately," she said carefully. "You don't have to, but I think you might want to hear him out." She led me down a narrow hallway past several doors until we stopped outside one marked Visitation Room C. When the door opened, I froze. It was Richard. Thinner than I remembered, older but unmistakably him. His hair was gray now, his once expensive suits replaced by a plain uniform. But it was his eyes that caught me off guard. No arrogance, no smugness. Just a hollow, tired kind of truth. "Catherine," he said quietly, "I didn't know you'd be the speaker today. I swear I didn't." For a moment I couldn't find my voice. My instinct was to turn and leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Please, just 5 minutes." Against every rational impulse, I sat down. He looked at his hands as he spoke. "You were right, you know. About everything. The lies, the greed, the gambling. I thought I was clever enough to beat the system, but I couldn't even beat myself." He gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Turns out the house always wins." I didn't respond, I just listened. He continued, his tone trembling. "In here, you have a lot of time to think. Too much, maybe. And I keep coming back to that night, the one when I sold the cabin. I can still hear your voice on the phone, the disbelief, the hurt. I told myself it was just business, but the truth is I enjoyed watching you lose. Because seeing someone else fall made me feel less like I was already on the ground." He looked up, eyes wet. "I'm sorry, Catherine. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I needed to say it." For the first time in years, I saw him not as a villain, but as a broken man staring at the rubble of his own making. It didn't make him innocent. It just made him human. I took a breath. Do you know what hurt the most, Richard? It wasn't losing the cabin. It was realizing that every kindness I ever gave you was just fuel for your greed. I wanted to believe you could change. I wanted to believe my mother hadn't married a monster. He flinched at that. She didn't, he whispered. She married a coward. There was silence for a long time. The kind of silence that fills the air when two people finally stop pretending. I can't forgive you, I said honestly. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I don't hate you anymore. Hate kept me tied to you. I don't want to be tied to you anymore. He nodded slowly, tears falling freely now. That's fair. When the guard returned to escort him out, he turned once more before leaving. Thank you for coming, even if you didn't mean to. I sat there long after he was gone, staring at the empty chair. My hands were shaking, but my heart felt strangely still. Because for the first time I realized forgiveness doesn't mean reopening the wound. It means closing it on your own terms. When I left the facility, the sun was setting, a slow gold spilling across the skyline. I sat in my car and cried. Not because of pain, but because I'd finally released the last weight I'd been carrying. That night back at the Lantern Ridge, I walked out onto the porch. The guests were asleep, the cabins quiet, the stars infinite above me. I thought of my father again, how he used to tell me that every storm eventually clears if you learn how to wait through it. I whispered into the still air. It's over, Dad. I finally let it go. The wind stirred gently through the pines, almost as if answering. A few months later, I received a letter from the rehabilitation center. It was short. Richard Calloway was released on probation for good behavior. He has entered a rehabilitation program and is currently working with financial counseling groups for recovering addicts. I read it, folded it neatly, and smiled faintly. Not because I was happy for him, but because I was finally free from needing to know. That spring, the Lantern Ridge expanded. We built a fifth cabin dedicated entirely to those healing from betrayal and family trauma. I named it the Cedar Room in honor of my father. Inside, I placed a small framed photo, me as a little girl sitting on his lap, both of us laughing on the porch of the original cabin. Below it, a plaque that read, "Some things you can lose and still keep forever." Sometimes when new guests arrived, they'd ask about the story behind the name. I'd smile and say, "It's about remembering where you came from and choosing where you go next." The Lantern Ridge had become more than I ever dreamed it could be. Every time a woman left with a steadier step, a calmer voice, or a light in her eyes that wasn't there when she arrived, I felt something inside me heal too. It was as if each of their stories filled another crack in my own. But peace is a fragile thing. It doesn't arrive with trumpets. It slips in quietly, and you only notice it when you realize how long it's been since you cried. By midsummer, the retreat had started drawing attention from journalists and local publications. A reporter from the Mountain Chronicle came up to do a feature piece. Her name was Allison Reed, a young woman with bright eyes and a notebook that never stopped moving. She was the kind of person who made everything sound poetic. We walked through this property as I showed her the gardens, the lodge, the small cabins dotted along the ridge. She asked about the origin of the retreat, how it came to be, what inspired it. I told her about grief and rebuilding, about my father's legacy, and the idea that broken places can still hold light. But I didn't mention Richard. I didn't want this place to carry his name, not even as part of the story of how I'd overcome him. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about everything that came after. Still, as we sat on the porch sipping tea, Allison looked up from her notes and said, "You talk about forgiveness in a way that sounds practiced, but not final. Have you ever forgiven the person who hurt you?" Her question cut through the air like a blade. I stared at the horizon where the sunlight burned over the mountain peaks. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I forgave what he did, but I haven't forgiven how long I let it define me." Allison nodded, writing something in her notebook. "That's the real kind of forgiveness, isn't it? Not for the other person, for yourself." I smiled faintly. "I think it is." The article came out 2 weeks later. It was beautiful, the woman who built a sanctuary from her scars. The photos showed the cabins glowing at dusk, the fire pit surrounded by laughter, and me standing at the edge of the ridge, the mountains stretching endlessly behind me. But what struck me most was the last line of the article. Allison wrote, "Sometimes the most powerful revenge is a life that no longer needs one." It went viral locally. Within a month, the retreat had a waiting list. I began hosting workshops, and women from all over Colorado and neighboring states started showing up not just to heal, but to learn how to help others do the same. It was overwhelming in the most humbling way. And then one crisp September morning, I got a letter. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. When I opened it, my breath caught. Catherine. It's Richard. I didn't know if I should write, but I need to tell you something. I'm leaving Colorado for good. The counselors say I need a clean start, so I've joined a volunteer program that helps rebuild homes for veterans in Montana. I wanted to say thank you. Not because you forgave me, but because you didn't destroy me when you could have. You made me face who I was. And in a strange way, that saved me. I don't expect you to reply. Just know that I've stopped gambling. I've stopped lying. I even started going to church again, though I mostly just sit in the back and listen. I'm learning how to be still. If you ever think of me, I hope it's not with anger anymore. Richard. I sat with that letter for a long time, my hands trembling slightly. I should have felt relief or closure or maybe even joy, but what I felt was something quieter, something I couldn't name at first. It was sadness. Not for me, for him. For all the years he wasted chasing things that didn't matter. For the man who could have been a father figure but chose to be a ghost instead. I folded the letter and placed it in the same wooden box where I kept my father's photos and the old cabin key. Then I whispered, "I hope you find peace too." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fire, the flames flickering shadows on the walls, and thought about how strange life is, how the people who once tore us apart can still become part of our redemption story if we let them. Not as villains, but as lessons. Over the next few weeks, something inside me began to shift. I found myself smiling more, laughing easily. Even the mountain air felt lighter. It was as if letting go of that last thread to Richard had finally freed me completely. And then one evening, a woman arrived at the retreat who reminded me so much of my younger self that I could hardly look at her without feeling a pull in my chest. Her name was Maggie, mid-30s. Dark circles under her eyes, fingers trembling when she spoke. She told me she'd been manipulated by her stepfather too, that he'd stolen her inheritance, left her in debt, made her doubt her own worth. When she finished, she whispered, "How do you live with it, knowing that the person who broke you gets to go on breathing?" Her question pierced straight through me. I looked at her, really looked the pain beneath the anger, the exhaustion behind her defiance. Then I took her hand gently and said, "You don't live with it. You live through it. You stop waiting for them to hurt like you did, and you start living so fully that their shadow can't reach you anymore." Tears filled her eyes. "But what if I can't?" "You can," I said softly, because I did. She stayed for 6 weeks. The day she left, she hugged me tightly and said, "You saved me." But as I watched her car disappear down the winding road, I realized something that made me smile. I hadn't saved her. I'd just shown her the way back to herself. That's what my father would have wanted the Lantern Ridge to be. Not a monument to pain, but a compass pointing home. That winter, I visited the old cabin again. The original one, the one Richard had once tried to sell. I hadn't been there in almost 2 years. Snow blanketed the roof and icicles hung from the eaves like crystals. The air was sharp, clean, endless. I stepped inside. The wood smelled the same aged pine and smoke. I ran my hand along the walls, whispered, "I'm back." And for the first time since my father's death, I didn't feel alone. I felt surrounded by memory, by peace, by everything I thought I'd lost but had somehow carried with me all along. I sat on the old rocking chair, the one I'd found in town and brought back months ago, and I cried. Not from grief, from gratitude. Because the story had come full circle, the cabin he built to hold love had survived betrayal, greed, fire, and time, and somehow so had I. The next morning, I placed a small wooden plaque above the door. It read, "This home was built by love, tested by loss, and reborn by truth." Then I locked the door and let the snow fall behind me as I walked down the mountain. By the time spring returned to the mountains, the snow had melted into streams that ran beside the road like silver ribbons. The Lantern Ridge was busier than ever, but not in a chaotic way, more like the rhythm of something alive and breathing. Every cabin was filled with people learning to live again. I'd often watch from my porch as laughter drifted through the pines, the kind of laughter that begins quietly but ends with joy that shakes the air. One morning I received another letter. This one came from Montana. The handwriting was familiar but steadier, stronger. Catherine, it's been 6 months since I wrote last. I wanted to let you know I've stayed clean, no gambling, no lies. The program I joined rebuilds homes for veterans, and for the first time in my life, I'm building something I don't want to lose. They gave me a small cabin to live in. Funny how life circles back, isn't it? Every night before bed, I walk outside and look at the stars. And I think about what you said in court, about not confusing winning with healing. I think I finally understand it now. I hope you're doing well, and I hope one day, when you see the mountains, you'll think of me, not as the man who took everything, but as the one who finally gave something back. Thank you for not destroying me when you could have. You gave me the chance to destroy who I was instead. Richard. I didn't cry this time. I simply folded the letter and smiled, not for him, but for the strange grace that life sometimes gives us when we stop expecting it. That evening, I told the story to one of my oldest guests, Elaine, who'd been coming to the Lantern Ridge since the very first year. She listened quietly, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "Do you think he's truly changed?" she asked. I looked at the fire, the way its light flickered like a heartbeat. I think some people spend their whole lives learning what love actually means. For some, it takes losing everything. For others, it takes being forgiven. She nodded slowly. "And for you?" I smiled softly. "For me, it took realizing that forgiveness isn't about letting someone back in. It's about letting them go without hate." That night, I dreamed of my father again. He was standing outside the cabin, the mountains glowing behind him, his face calm. I could almost hear his voice. "You finally understand, don't you? The real inheritance was never the cabin. It was your strength." When I woke, the morning light was spilling through the window, golden and warm. I took a deep breath and whispered, "Yes, Dad, I do." A few weeks later, the Lantern Ridge hosted a retreat themed "Letting Go of What Broke You." It was our biggest group, yet 30 women from all walks of life. Teachers, nurses, mothers, widows. We sat around the fire on the last night, each of them taking turns sharing the one thing they were finally ready to release. When it was my turn, I hesitated. I'd spent years helping others unburden themselves, but I hadn't realized I still had one left of my own. I stared into the flames, and before I even knew what I was saying, the words came. "I'm letting go of guilt. The guilt of not saving everyone I loved. The guilt of not seeing the betrayal coming. The guilt of thinking that being kind meant never saying no." The group was silent. The fire popped softly, throwing sparks into the dark. And I continued, "I'm letting go of the part of me that still waits for an apology I already gave to myself." A few women started crying. Others nodded through their tears. I smiled, wiping my own. Because if I've learned anything, it's this. We don't heal when others change. We heal when we decide we deserve peace more than we deserve answers. That night, as the women hugged each other and left candles flickering by the ridge, I looked up at the stars. For the first time, I didn't think of Richard or my mother, or even my father. I just thought of how far I'd come and how much further I could still go. Later that year, the Mountain Chronicle returned to do a follow-up story. Allison Reed met me on the same porch where she'd first interviewed me 2 years earlier. She smiled as she looked around at the newly built cabins, the lush gardens, the children's laughter echoing through the valley. "You've built something extraordinary, Catherine," she said. "You've turned pain into purpose. People call this place a miracle." I shook my head. "It's not a miracle. It's just proof that what tries to destroy us doesn't get the last word if we don't let it." She smiled softly. "Then what do you call it?" I looked at the mountains, the way the sunlight painted them gold, the trees whispering in the wind, and said, "I call it redemption." She closed her notebook, her eyes glimmering. "May I quote you on that?" "Please do." The next week, the headline read, "From Betrayal to Redemption, the woman who rebuilt the mountain, her stepfather tried to steal." When I saw that, I laughed. Not out of bitterness, but because it was true, not just literally, but spiritually. Richard had tried to steal my mountain, but instead he gave me the courage to climb it. Months later, on a cool autumn afternoon, I received one final letter. This one didn't have a return address. Catherine, if you're reading this, I'm gone. The doctors told me last month. Lung cancer, years of bad choices catching up, I guess. But don't be sad for me. I'm not afraid anymore. I just wanted you to know I left something for you. The deed to the small cabin here in Montana, it's yours now. Maybe one day you'll visit. There's a good view of the stars at night, just like the ridge. It's quiet, peaceful. I think you'd like it. Thank you for letting me live long enough to become someone better. I hope you know you changed me even if I never deserved it. Goodbye, Catherine. Richard. I didn't go to Montana right away. I waited until spring. When I finally did, I found the cabin exactly as he'd described. Small, simple, with a porch that faced an endless sky. I stood there for a long time, the breeze carrying the scent of pine and rain, and for the first time I whispered his name without anger. Goodbye, Richard. I hope you found what you were looking for. Then as the sun sank behind the mountains, I took a deep breath and smiled. Because somehow in the strangest way he'd given me back the thing he once took peace. Now whenever I tell this story sitting in front of the fire at the Lantern Ridge, surrounded by women who think they'll never heal, I end it the same way. Sometimes the people who break us are the ones who teach us where our strength begins. The betrayal isn't the ending. It's the beginning of the story where you find out who you truly are. Forgive not because they deserve it, but because you deserve to be free. And every time I say it, I can almost feel my father's hand on my shoulder, steady and proud.